This video is sponsored by Squarespace. There are many reasons why companies struggle to be environmentally sustainable, whether it's our ego-driven obsession with scale or the fact that we're working in a system that never really prioritizes the health of our planet. By the end of this video, you'll be more educated and able to make better decisions around how we might design a more sustainable future. Okay, so first of all, this is a really complex topic, all right? It's not like I'm just gonna solve the world's problems in a 20-minute YouTube video, but I do have some insights from working as a designer for the past decade that are going to be helpful in providing context. Big shout out to these people in my Discord, and especially my friend Rafi Manassian, who's been a designer in the field for over 40 years. Okay, so in order to really understand the situation that we're in right now, we have to go back to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Now, when mass production and the Industrial Revolution got started in the mid-1700s, the primary goal was growth at all costs. Industrialization was moving at breakneck speeds, and one of the first industries to be affected was textiles. Before the Industrial Revolution, it would take almost 2 weeks for a skilled artisan to weave 6 kilograms of raw material into usable thread. The artisan would spin 1 spool of thread at once. Now, with the invention of certain tools like the spinning jenny, one person could spin 8 spools of thread at once, and eventually, the machines could spin up to 120 spools at one time. Of course, that's 120 times faster. So within the space of a few years, it went from artisans making 2 pieces of cloth per month to massive factories making 1,000 pieces of cloth in a day. This increase in efficiency, of course, made the cloth a lot cheaper, which meant that more people could afford to buy many articles of clothing. So before the Industrial Revolution, you might own 2 or 3 shirts that you made yourself or bought from an artisan. If your shirt ripped, you would sew it back together. After the Industrial Revolution, people were buying many articles of clothing, and if they ripped, it was sometimes easier to just buy another one. These products were specifically designed to have an end of life because they were relatively inexpensive to produce. This was great from a business perspective because the companies had recurring revenue through repeat customers. This, coupled with early advertising to drive demand, was the beginning of unsustainable industrialization. And really, to humans, there's nothing more exciting than the power of scale. 1 squirrel toy is good. 10 squirrel toys is better. 10,000 is almost overwhelming. It's the scalability of industry that excites our ego and drives creative growth. And the Industrial Revolution enabled this massive scaling of manufactured goods. You might start with humble intentions at first, but as soon as the prospect of massive scale becomes a possibility, you get lost in the hope for something bigger. It's a tale as old as time, and this psychological, ego-driven need for more is in all of us. And on that note, you should subscribe. Make the number next to my name bigger. I don't know, it doesn't really mean anything, but it does make me happy. So, got nothing to lose, and you might learn something. There were no questions around creating a more sustainable or integrated system in the 1700s. It was just sprawling growth and scaling with patches on top of patches, everyone clamoring to expand their output as quickly as possible. The closest equivalent example I can think of in modern times would probably be the rise of the internet and social media. Mark Zuckerberg is infamously known for his motto, "Move fast and break things," in regards to his social media empire, and it was a similar attitude among industrialists in the 1700s and 1800s. Now, not everyone was thrilled with this ruthless forward progression. Groups like the Luddites would actually go into factories and destroy the textile machinery because they saw it as a threat to their job security. Working conditions were also really dangerous, and it wasn't uncommon for employees to work in factories for 14 hours a day. In spite of all that, many people saw it as an exciting and prosperous time, and this rapid expansion continued for over 150 years. The prices of goods went down because they could be manufactured much more cheaply and at greater scale. There were lots of opportunities for work, and as a result, the quality of life for the average person was actually improving. Wealth also wasn't as closely tied to land ownership and royalty like it was with prior generations, so the ability to make a decent living in the world was more equitable. Just to be clear, there isn't much clarity around how good industrialization was for the factory workers. Some say it was good, some say it was horrible and oppressive. One thing that no economist can seriously deny is that by the end of the Industrial Revolution, the average person had achieved a very high standard of living compared to pretty much any other time in history. So we're still running on this antiquated 300-year-old system of conducting business. There isn't really a clear place for sustainability because it runs counter to the growth at all costs model. Even today, if companies aren't careful, they very easily become fueled by short-term interest. Companies don't want to see profits in 5 years after a huge R&D effort around sustainability. They want to see it now. By putting R&D into sustainability, companies are giving their competitors an opportunity to overtake them. This is how companies operate. To be fair, it's not like the early industrialists ever intended to create the environmental issues we have today. Even back in the 1700s, People had a concept of how natural resources were precious and finite. It's just that the health of the environment was a secondary consideration. Some argue that early industrialists were trying to improve the overall standard of living for everyone, which is a noble goal, but it did come at a great cost to the environment. So fast forwarding to the present day, one of the main reasons why companies struggle to be sustainable is because they don't take the entire supply chain into account. Even if companies are genuinely trying to be more eco-friendly and eco-efficient in their processes, it's insanely difficult to do it effectively. Even simple things like avoiding toxic materials isn't straightforward. So for example, benzene is a highly toxic chemical that can contaminate water, soil, and the air. It's a substance that's commonly found in plastics, resins, and synthetic fibers. It's illegal in the US. However, it's totally possible that the factory that made your products overseas uses benzene and traces of it are in the products that are shipped to you. Now, it is possible to find factories that follow the strictest guidelines around sustainability. They can even be certified by third-party environmental organizations. But even that isn't a guarantee that you're getting something that's truly sustainable. If your eco-friendly manufacturer is overloaded with work, they'll often subcontract the production to another factory to do the work for them. This is really common in manufacturing. I've even heard stories where the original factory handed off the work to another subcontractor, and that subcontractor subcontracted the work to another manufacturer. That's not uncommon at all. And at that point, you really have no visibility around how your product is being made, what chemicals are being used to make it, or what the working conditions are like in the factory. The only way to know whether your product is actually being made in an eco-conscious factory is to have an employee from your company on the ground supervising the operation. Some companies do have these kinds of supervisory representatives, but many of them don't. One thing that requires almost zero physical resources is Squarespace. I've used Squarespace for my own portfolio site for over a decade. It's packed with features that make it easy for anyone to make a website quickly. If you're making a portfolio site and you want to make something fast, they have some absolutely beautiful layouts that will make your work shine. Their website builder is the best in the business, so you can customize templates with simple drag and drop controls. If you want to go deeper, you can customize your site fully with CSS. There's a reason why I've been using Squarespace for so long. It's easy to use and fully customizable. Head to squarespace.com/designtheory to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain using code DESIGNTHEORY. Back to the video. The origin of your materials also complicates things. So wool is generally viewed as a sustainable material. However, the location and farm you source it from has a lot to do with how eco-friendly it is. In Argentina, the sheep that are used to harvest wool are not indigenous to the region, and their hooves are too harsh on the grass, so they trample it and stop it from growing. Sheep also tend to tear out the grass from the roots when they eat, rather than nibble the top of the grass like other species native to the area. The non-indigenous sheep cause the fertile Argentine grassland to turn into desert. Less grass means less moisture, which leads to higher temperatures and more arid climates. Even though wool is a sustainable material and it can even be carbon negative, if it doesn't come from the right place, it can actually be terrible for the environment. Another thing is that the effectiveness of sustainability can be really hard to measure. So for example, solder is a metal that is melted and used to connect different wires to each other or different parts of a circuit board. There are dozens of soldered joints in pretty much every electronic device you use, whether it's your phone, your computer, or your car stereo. A lot of solder uses lead because it has a relatively low melting point and it creates really durable solder joints. However, lead is highly toxic and the fine particulates can contaminate the air. As a result of that, many companies have been moving away from lead as a material for solder, and they're using tin instead. That seems like an easy fix, right? I mean, lead is more toxic than tin, so let's switch to tin. Finally, a straightforward decision. Unfortunately, it is a not so clear cut. So while tin is far less toxic, it doesn't always create a solder joint that's as strong as lead. So over time, the tin can expand outward, creating these little whiskers, and these tin whiskers can connect to other pieces of the electronics assembly, which then causes the device to short out and break. So rather than repairing the device, the customer typically just buys a new one because repairing these highly specialized electronics is extremely difficult or sometimes even impossible. A lot of these products are specifically designed to be thrown away and not repaired. Even though lead solder is highly toxic, there are some papers that have found that tin solder is more harmful than lead for the environment because if the solder joints are less durable, the customer is more likely to throw the entire product away and buy a new one. I'm not saying that we should use toxic materials like lead in our products. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that using eco-friendly materials alone isn't going to solve the problem. On the bright side, new legislation around the right to repair has been gaining traction in the last few years, and many laws will pass to make it easier to repair certain electronics. so that faulty solder joint won't make your entire product useless. I'll probably make a video on right to repair at some point in the future. This also leads me to another point. The validity around any sustainability claim needs to be heavily scrutinized. I have no idea who funded that lead versus tin solder life cycle analysis paper. Maybe it was a company that manufactures lead solder and they have an ulterior motive. I'm not a material scientist or a life cycle analyst, so I'm not making the claim one way or another. The links to my sources are in the description, but once again, these sorts of life cycle analyses are really complicated. We will eventually paint a clear picture, but it just takes time. There also aren't a lot of sustainable options that can compete with things like plastic in terms of price and utility. Plastic is durable, it can be used in many different situations, it stands up to weathering, and it has a wide range of material properties. Plastic can be clear, it can have different colors, it can be flexible, it can be stiff, or it can be a super thin film. Let's use this computer mouse as an example. It's made out of plastic. I mean, what other material could I use that's sustainable? I mean, bamboo, cork. From a usability perspective, some kind of plastic is realistically the best option. There are bioplastics and recycled plastics out there that could be used, but they usually are more expensive, and you still need to source your materials from reputable vendors and manufacturers. And you also need to create a system to collect the products at the end of their life cycle to repurpose the materials. Once again, an eco-friendly material in isolation isn't automatically going to be better for the environment. Understanding this overarching system is extremely difficult, but it actually gets even more complicated because of the mismatched incentives of all the people involved in product development. Whether that's the company selling the products, the employees making the products, or the customers buying the products. Then, when you add in government legislation, things get even more tricky. So let's start with the customer, since that includes all of us watching. Just as a disclaimer, I'm not really trying to make you feel guilty. Feeling guilty isn't going to solve the problem, all right? Doing something different will. The first step is educating yourself, so just keep watching. Right now, Patagonia has a program where you can return any piece of clothing you've bought from them, and they'll repair it, free of charge. In 2020, 50,000 garments were repaired in their facility in Reno, Nevada. Now, that sounds great until you realize that Patagonia brought in $1 billion in revenue last year. I couldn't find any information on the actual number of individual garments they sell, but it's gotta be millions of pieces of clothing every year. With that in mind, 50,000 repairs really isn't that much. I don't have this figure, but I'd be surprised if even 10% of the garments that Patagonia sells actually get repaired when they're broken. That's a lot better than nothing, but it's far from ideal. What's more likely is that the customer simply buys a new piece of clothing. I don't think Patagonia is to blame for this. I think that Patagonia's customers aren't making the most of the repair program. In all honesty though, Patagonia probably relies on you not using this repair program, otherwise they'd probably go out of business. Even though this system is in place, customers don't use it to its full potential. Now, there are two reasons for this, I think. The first one is that consumers have been conditioned to value convenience above pretty much everything else. It's why Amazon has become one of the most valuable companies in history. Let's look at the two options side by side, whether you buy a new garment or repair it. After your jacket rips, buying a new one just means looking online, clicking a single button to buy, and having it arrive at your door in a couple of days. Repairing an item means printing out a shipping label, packing the jacket safely, and waiting for UPS to come to pick up your package to be delivered to the repair facility. Then you have to wait 10 to 15 weeks for Patagonia to actually do the repair. And this doesn't guarantee that they'll actually be able to repair the garment. So the Amazon one-click shopping model is just way more convenient. It also completely separates us psychologically from the time and effort it takes to actually build a product. Another reason is that we just love getting the shiny new product in the fancy packaging. It's not as fun to get the same jacket repaired over and over again. There are 8 billion people on the planet, and every single one of us wants to have everything. I'm not sure how we strike the balance between the need for the new and the need to take care of our planet. The latter is obviously more important though. What I do know is that sustainable living requires a behavioral change on our part, which isn't going to be easy or fast. Another big problem is that customers simply aren't informed. It's unfortunate, but the reality is that companies lie all the time about their sustainability efforts. It's way easier to make a product appear sustainable rather than actually make it sustainable. Companies rely on your ignorance, so they slap some green stripes on the product and use some eco-friendly material with no consideration for the larger system. This is why educating yourself is so important. Lastly, people prioritize price and quality over sustainability. Remember all the reasons why sustainability is so complicated? Well, that's exactly why it's more expensive. All of those R&D efforts need to yield a return on their investment. Plus, the materials themselves are usually more expensive and sometimes, but not always, lower quality. Once again, my point is not to make you feel guilty about this. Rather than feeling guilty, let's do something to fix it. But first, I'll go into how designers are at fault. That's me. So my friend Rafi introduced me to this little thought experiment that we're about to do. This applies to designers, engineers, or really anyone who enjoys making things or who does it for a living. Imagine you had an opportunity to share your proudest creation with millions of people. You'd probably be really excited about that. The environmental costs of shipping that product or the materials it took to make it probably crossed your mind, but you'd quickly forget about it once you saw a bunch of people on the streets using your design. And this shows a fundamental issue on the side of the people who make products. We want our ideas to live, even if it's at the expense of everything else. Ego plays into this, but it's not the only thing. And I'm 100% guilty of this. I don't see an obvious solution. I mean, sure, it's easy for someone to just say, only work with companies who are committed to designing sustainable products, but it's a lot more complicated than that. If you're in the business of making things, you're going to be put in an uncomfortable position when it comes to sustainability efforts. If you don't make the company money, you won't get a promotion, or in more extreme cases, you might even lose your job if you fail to perform. It's so much easier to see the short-term loss of not being able to take care of your family or pay your rent, as opposed to the long-term, slow destruction of the planet. Now, I want to make it clear, the destruction of the planet is a seemingly distant and abstract concept. I'm not saying that it isn't real, but you can't immediately see the results of it. I mean, sure, there are videos of polar bears stranded on icebergs all over the internet and dramatic imagery of heavy machinery destroying rainforests, but your family is right there, sitting across from you in your living room. Suddenly, the right decision doesn't seem so easy to make. And who is that right decision even for? It's very easy to rationalize decisions against sustainability in this context. Eventually, you'll start to think, okay, well, is my contribution to this really even that big of a deal? I mean, is it really that bad? You know, maybe it's not so bad in the grand scheme of things. And I'm not defending this behavior, but if you're a designer or you're involved in any kind of product development, you will be faced with these kinds of decisions. Taking the ethical path is a lot harder than you think. And I've just been part of so many teams where I've brought up an environmental concern or somebody else has, and the response from upper management is something like, oh, this is absolutely a major concern of ours, but we need to get this design out by Q3 if we want to meet our sales goals. Let's talk about it in the next product refresh in 2 years. On the bright side, I have seen some big successes on the sustainability front. I recommend sustainable practices whenever it's possible to my clients, and I've begun to do even more research in this area so that I can help clients make better decisions. But it's a process that takes time. Companies are at fault too. Sometimes companies are just ignorant about the impact of their products. Other times they're intentionally misleading. One of the best examples of this is the Fiji Water Company. Fiji Water markets their products as something that is untouched by man. The design of the water bottle and marketing materials all showcase pristine tropical landscapes, with the implication that Fiji Water is a sustainable product. But there's absolutely nothing sustainable or pristine about bottling water in plastic containers that take hundreds of years to degrade, and then transporting those bottles halfway around the world with ships and trucks that use toxic diesel fuel. I think we can all agree that Fiji Water's design and marketing tactics are dubious at best. I know it seems unthinkable that something like this could happen, but when you sort of consider the growth at all costs system that we're in and the uninformed customer base, it's actually surprising that this kind of thing doesn't happen more often. The last piece of the puzzle that makes things difficult are lawmakers. Now, to be clear, there's plenty of legislation that's great. You could argue that legislation is one of the best ways to encourage change around sustainability. However, it's important to remember that laws intended to help with sustainability can have unintended consequences. The laws need to be crafted very carefully. One example of this was an effort to improve air quality in Mexico City. The legislators wanted to decrease vehicle emissions. The program bans drivers from using their vehicles 1 day a week based on the last digit of their license plate. So for example, vehicles with a license plate ending in 5 or 6 could not be used on Mondays. Everyone follows this law in Mexico City. You'll be ruthlessly ticketed by the police if you don't. You'd think that people would drive less and therefore emissions would be lower. Legislators were hoping that citizens would turn to public transportation services. But it turns out that this law actually made vehicle emissions even worse. Many people either bought a second vehicle so they could drive for 7 days a week, or they would just use taxis to get around on the days that they weren't allowed to use their car. My point in bringing this up is not to say that government legislation is bad. I'm trying to demonstrate that legislation needs to be done thoughtfully. Rather than having a law that restricts driving, perhaps a more robust public transportation system would have been a better choice. What I can say with certainty is that people are going to go with whatever option suits their needs. If they need convenience and speed, they're going to take a taxi in Mexico City. Lawmakers ignored the customer's natural behavior and inclinations and ultimately came up with a failed program as a result. So what do? This all seems pretty hopeless. Now, I know this video is kind of a downer, but there is hope. The first step is educating yourself, like I've been saying throughout the video, and you clearly are doing that. Understanding that mankind is driven by scale is also fundamentally important. My friend Rafi was saying maybe we just need to shift the paradigm from physical possessions to different scales. We can retrain our minds to seek out domains that scale to totally different outcomes. As designers, we live through our imagination, but it doesn't have to be limited to our geography or the making of objects in this wasteful level of consumption. I think this kind of psychological shift in thinking will be important in reaching a more sustainable future. On a more concrete level, access to sustainable materials and processes is better than ever. There are even some materials that are carbon negative, which means they remove more carbon and harmful greenhouse gases than they emit, as long as they're used within a well-designed system. Things like wool, bamboo, cork, or bioplastics, like green polyethylene, are all viable options. There are even some augmented reality interface options that are purely digital, so you don't need to use any material at all. And with new legislation around right to repair, there's real hope for actually creating a circular, sustainable economy. The Steam Deck is a handheld video game console that's much easier to repair, or maybe even upgrade. The introduction of automation and robotics could also help with sustainability. The process of painting cars on an industrial scale has been drastically improved with robots. They use the paint far more efficiently. It's not inconceivable that automated robots could disassemble products and recycle them for future use faster than any human ever could. We need to make changes to the antiquated system, but that change takes time. So in the meantime, we need to make product designs work within our current system. That means that every design decision you make must either make the company money or save it money, either directly or indirectly. While the goals of making eco-friendly products are important, we need to understand the inner workings of the larger system in order to affect positive change. The more you understand the underlying incentives of business, the easier it will be for you to implement good design choices that are good for the environment and good for your customers. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing or joining my Patreon. I have a bunch of cool perks on there that you should check out. I appreciate you watching, and I hope you have a great day.